Well, the reading from the Gospel today is focused on the relationship between people doing ministry. And one of the early challenges of the first generations of Christians was to try to understand how John the Baptist and Jesus fit together. John the Baptist was an extraordinarily popular figure, attracting thousands of people to his ministry. And the followers of Jesus had to somehow decide what that relationship was. Luke does it by making them family. And we all know how that can go. So it was a challenge. But it strikes me that today, when I am so mindful of my ordination and my ministry, that I'm going to take a point of personal privilege and talk about my ordained ministry and take some highlights out of it. So like Charles Dickens, I was born, beginning by David Copperfield. I did not come out wearing a set of vestments with my eyes set on Jerusalem. Instead, I had a very ordinary childhood, albeit in a family of church-going Episcopalians. And really nothing in my life suggested that I would pursue this as a vocation. Although I think my mother set me on my way, and I've told this story before, I'm just going to repeat it briefly. When it came time to go to kindergarten, the first day of kindergarten at Roosevelt Elementary School, named for Teddy, not FDR, may I hasten to add, in Ossining, New York, in 1960, my mother brought me with a lot of tearful children to our first day of kindergarten together. And as you know, it can be a traumatic day, leaving home and mom to be taught by this stranger among strangers, leaving everything that we've known up till then. And there were a lot of crying children, including me. And my mother pulled me aside and whispered to me, "Do you see that little girl over there sitting at that table? She's very sad. Why don't you go over and see if you can help?" The die was cast. Little did she know it, but she set me on that trajectory right to ordination. When I got out of college, I looked for the local Episcopal church on the west side of New York, not thinking anything about ordination, just doing what my family had always done, which is go to church. And it was a small parish in need of volunteers, and within the first or second Sunday that I was there, remember, I was a callow 22-year-old, the rector asked me if I would teach church school. So I said, sure, and I started teaching church school, much to the amusement of my friends who were out on Saturday night partying and going off into the city. I always had to go home because I had church school the next day. And in the course of that, questions that the kids asked me about what the Bible meant and who Jesus was, I had never really thought of myself. And in trying to come up or articulate an answer to them, I found my faith deepening and drawing me to the thought of possibly being ordained. And that process continued, and that was an important formation. But also equally important was a conversation that a group of my college friends had one night at dinner. And you know, we were at that point in our late 20s when you decide you have to start to take your life seriously and decide what you're going to do. And someone said, well, what do we want to do, with the life that's going to ahead of us? And one person said, I heard a really interesting question that someone said, which is, you should think of where you feel most at home, and that's what you should do, ideally, is your job. And I have to say I was surprised, because the thought that immediately came into my head was church. And I paid attention to that and got permission to go to seminary, went to seminary in England, where I had a great time. I will say that recently I came across the letters that went back and forth between the dean of the seminary, Benedict Green, Father Benedict, and my bishop, Paul Moore, here in New York. For some reason, Paul sent me the copies of what the dean was saying. And every quarter, there would be a report back from the dean to the sponsoring bishop of the young men at that time who were being considered for ordination. And Benedict Green wrote, Richard continues to do well in seminary, fits in very well, being the only American. However, he doesn't seem to take seriously the seminary education we're offering him. And Paul wrote back and said, Dear Father Benedict, I'm so sorry to hear that Richard is not taking things seriously, but really that's one of the things that I like most about him. I will say in seminary, one of the high points of my seminary was that we would, during Holy Week, there was complete silence during meals. And in the refectory where we would have our meals, you were supposed to bring an improving book for our spiritual development and read in silence. And everyone would ostentatiously take their copies of Aquinas or Julian of Norwich or Luther and prop them up and have their meal. And I decided the book I was going to bring for Holy Week that year was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. So you can see it was a bit of a struggle having me in seminary. And I came out and was ordained, got a job as assistant. Remember the days when Episcopal churches had assistants, as a matter of course, and it was normal. I got a job as an assistant down in St. John's, Getty Square, Yonkers. And I chose that parish, and they chose me, really meeting with the rector was who made the decision, because I thought it was so different from any place I'd ever served or been in or worshiped in. It was a huge barn of a place. It could seat 1,200 people. And I guarantee you there were not 1,200 Episcopalians left in Yonkers in 1985. And it was a great place. It did incredible social ministry, social justice ministry. And one of the things I vividly remember about the place is that it ran a men's shelter in the church. And every night, my apartment as the assistant was above the parish hall. And in order to get to my apartment, if I'd been out, I had to go through the men's shelter, sort of weaving my way between the cots. And I'll never forget that that was my first real experience of people who I couldn't just walk past, but were somehow where I was at home. And the contrast between my life of comfort and ease and security couldn't have been more jarring or awakening for me. And then after 3 years in Yonkers, I went on to be on my own in a parish at Zion and Dobbs Ferry, and I was there for 22 years. And it was a great parish, small, struggling. We worried constantly about money and how to pay our bills and how to keep going. But it was a parish in the time that I was there that I developed very deep roots and relationships with the people. So much so that I would have been probably content to stay there. Except one time going down to see the bishop, he said, do you want to stay in Dobbs Ferry for the rest of your ministry? And I said, well, I really haven't thought about it. And he said, well, let me recommend some parishes as they come up down the road just for you to consider. And I said, okay. But what was great about Zion was it allowed me to become authentic and really ground my ministry in who I was. And I'll tell you a quick story about that. I was on the Diocesan Youth Ministry Council at that point, and we would periodically during the course of the year have retreats for teenagers. And there was one retreat that we had organized, and I can't remember the theme of the retreat, but they were all carefully planned and orchestrated. And there would be about 20 or 25 young people who would come, and maybe 5 or 10 adults that would lead it. In this particular retreat, I wasn't able to stay overnight on Saturday. I had to get back to the parish. So we started the program, and then for some reason, it opened up to questions and answers, where the kids could ask the adults questions that they had. And one of the kids asked, what does the church have to say about homosexuality? And everyone sort of looked a little bit nervous. And then one of the other adults started talking and answering the question and said, well, it's a terrible sin, and it must be addressed. And you must root it out, you must try to heal and move past this terrible thing. And I watched the other kids and their expressions, and I thought, I can either be quiet or I can speak my truth. So I said, you know, there's another perspective in the Episcopal Church. And I want to tell you that the Episcopal Church believes in acceptance of ourselves, and us accepting ourselves, as well as the church accepting, if not celebrating, who we really are. So I got up quickly then from the retreat to leave, and a small group of kids came out to say goodbye and to thank me. You know, and I've often thought back, like teachers, priests don't know what they've done in terms of what they've said or the way that they've interacted with people. And I've often thought, I wonder what happened to those kids at that retreat. The other thing that Dobbs Ferry taught me was that there were vast differences in our parish politically. But we were able to be unified in serving the gospel, in doing the ministry that all of us were called to do at our baptism. Our baptism was bigger and more important than any political party that we were part of. And so came the day that the bishop said, you know, there's a parish up in Rhinebeck that I think you'd be great for. And I said, Rhinebeck? Why would they send me to Rhinebeck? I'm in Westchester County. And I went up and fell in love with the parish and had a great, great time being their priest. And what was wonderful about Messiah was that it tested every part of what it meant to be a parish priest. And little did I know, because they kept this secret from me in the interview process, they needed a $6.5 million capital campaign in order to save the church building. And we did that journey together. And then we did the journey of COVID together. And all of it remained together as a congregation. And in my time there, I like to think that Messiah was the church that everyone turned to when they needed some place to meet, whether it was a funeral for someone that didn't believe or attend church but needed a place for a funeral, or if it was a program that would help build the community around us. It was very, very busy. My story from Messiah Rhinebeck I've told before, I think, but I'll tell again. And that is, as we were coming out of COVID, I was at the local grocery store, Tops, on Route 9. I was wearing my collar, and we were still kind of keeping our distance a bit from each other, people in public. And I saw that there was an elderly woman next to me, and I was staying there patiently as she was staring up at the shelves where I wanted to go. And she turned to me and said, could you reach up and grab that loaf of bread? I can't reach it. And I said, sure. So I reached up and grabbed the loaf of bread and handed it to her. And she said, you know, I knew you'd help because you're that priest at Messiah, right? And they help people. I thought that was not a bad summary of ministry. But I was very tired. In fact, I was exhausted. Between all the things that were going on, the many programs that we began and ran successfully, the building of saving the building, the capital campaign, and COVID, after 14 years, I was very tired. And I began thinking, since I was already qualified for retirement, about full retirement from ministry. And I thought, well, what I'll do is, I'm of a generation, I'll hire a consultant. So I found a retirement coach in New York City. And I went to see him several times. And he was great. And I walked in saying, you know, I'm exhausted. And all I want to do is be in the pews with the congregation in my retirement and be able to tell the rector how much I dislike the sermons. And that seemed a fixed idea. Tim and I had talked about it when Tim completed his time, whenever that might be, at Messiah as director of music. Then we would go forward and retire up to Vermont. And that, we both love the state, and that was our destination for retirement. But in talking to the retirement coach, he said a number of things. He said, you know, in listening to you, you don't seem like the kind of person who goes from 65 miles an hour to 0 very quickly. And I said, well, that's true. And he said, and also, what would you miss about being a parish priest with a congregation? And I said, well, two things, really. One is that I would miss finding meaning and talking about that on a weekly basis, sharing perhaps thoughts I'd had or reflections, trying to weave together some kind of meaning in this journey of life that we're all on together. And I would miss that and probably drive Tim crazy by telling him all my insights on a weekly basis. But the other thing was I would miss feeling useful, that somehow my calling as a priest had ended with my retirement. And yes, I could find places to volunteer or be involved, but it wouldn't be the same. And he said, why not find a parish that uses your gifts of ministry and isn't quite as demanding in the same way that Messiah has been? And lo and behold, St. Peter's came on the horizon. And I want to think about St. Peter's for a minute and what it means to me. There's a wonderful phrase which is surprised by joy. And that's exactly how I feel. It wasn't any surprise that I would come to be comfortable and like St. Peter's. I knew many of you from different things in the community. But what I was surprised by was falling in love and developing this profound love for you, for this congregation, and this community. So much so that Tim's and my plans took a 180. And we suddenly, in talking with each other, said, why are we going to Vermont? This is great. Tim can continue doing his ministry at Messiah, which he loves and so successful. And as it turned out, I found the best congregation in the Episcopal Church. All of you who here at St. Peter's. It's been a place where I feel I've come home. It reminds me of the same conversation I had after college. I feel I've landed in a place and with people that I understand, that I appreciate, that I'm honored to be with you on this faith journey, and that I love. You know, this past week, I saw Matt at a trustees meeting, and he said, how are things going at St. Peter's? And I said, really well. It's really great. Everything about it is fantastic. It feels like a very successful marriage. And Matt said, well, you know, and Matt is so wise. He said, you know, the only thing people really want is to be loved. And isn't that true? Isn't that a profound truth of our existence and our faith? How lucky I am to be here at St. Peter's. In a time when I thought my ministry was going to finish, I found it's more profound and deep and rewarding than I could have dreamed of. And as I celebrate my anniversary, I can't help but think how lucky we are that a God watches over us, that surprises us again and again with grace and opportunity. It's like the wonderful passage from Isaiah. There are green, beautiful fields ahead of us that we can't even dream of, that we don't know are there. But God guides us to those places where our hearts can sing. And I'm so grateful to have that experience here at St. Peter's with all of you. You know, each year, on the anniversary of my ordination, I've said, excuse me, a prayer from the prayer book, which is said at celebration of a new ministry. It's not in the ordination prayers, but I think it's one of the most beautiful prayers in the prayer book. And if you want to turn to your prayer books, I'm going to pray it here from the pulpit, but you can follow and read it if you want as I'm saying it. It encapsulates everything I think about ministry. Page 562. I'll pray. O Lord my God, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, yet you have called your servant to stand in your house and to serve at your altar. To you and to your service I devote myself, body, soul, and spirit. Fill my memory with the record of your mighty works. Enlighten my understanding with the light of your Holy Spirit. And may all the desires of my heart and will center in what you would have me do. Make me an instrument of your salvation for the people entrusted to my care, and grant that I may faithfully administer your holy sacraments. And by my life and teaching, set forth your true and living word. Be always with me in carrying out the duties of my ministry. In prayer, quicken my devotion. In praises, heighten my love and gratitude. In preaching, give me readiness of thought and expression, and grant that by the clearness and brightness of your holy word, all the world may be drawn into your blessed kingdom. All this I ask for the sake of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.